let's introduce ourselves, Rich. Got a nice pictures here of both
Yeah,
of
look at
us.
those.
So I'm Dr. Andres Fonseca. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Thrive. My background is I'm a consultant psychiatrist. So yeah, so I'll be talking to you about anxiety in the workplace specifically, but anxiety in general. And with me is Richard Middleton. Richard, do you want to sort of introduce yourself?
Yeah. Thank you, Andres. It's great to co-host this webinar and a subject I'm very passionate about. So I head up the customer team at Thrive. No doubt many of our customers and employees that have access to our service are on this webinar, and no doubt people that aren't so familiar with Thrive. So welcome to you all. Hope you enjoy the session. We'll try and make it as interactive as possible, and hopefully a useful session for you.
Yeah, let's see if we can meet those objectives. So we want to sort of, I mean, it's a basic session on a global understanding of anxiety. We are going to be focusing on how it may manifest or how you may come across it in the workplace. But obviously, anxiety is a condition that may affect us in all aspects of our lives. Yeah. So whilst we are going to be making some specific or giving some specific examples about how it may manifest in the workplace, or what the risk factors that you might encounter that are unique to the workplace might be, we do want to sort of make it a bit broader and just give you a wider understanding of the issue. You'll see in our case studies that we'll do a little bit later that we also refer to sort of, for example, teenagers. And we know that a lot of the people that attend our seminars are parents, and having a teenager at home might be very anxiety-inducing for us as parents. So we sort of do a little bit of that as well when we talk about anxiety. As you'll see, it's quite relevant for good reason that we're going to sort of cover. So yeah, we've got here the basic stops, or the basic things that we're going to try to get to grips with. And towards the end of the session, we'll have things that we've got, sort of sessions in the Thrive app that can help people cope with anxiety, manage anxiety better. So I thought I put here a definition of what anxiety is in terms of what somebody like me, like a doctor. So when I'm trying to make a diagnosis of anxiety, so is what differentiates like normal worry from something that is a health condition, right? Is trying to sort of make that differentiation. And obviously, as you might expect, we do encounter something that is on a continuum. So you do have to make, you have to put the line somewhere. So there's a description of the condition that you have to follow, and then you have to. This is just a description that I might encounter in the International Classification of Disease, version 11, which is something that is commonly used in Europe. You might be familiar with the DSM that is mostly used in the States, but the definitions are very similar. And I think that the thing to draw your attention here in this definition is that there is dysfunction, and there is distress, and that the dysfunction affects people in their personal, family, social, educational, occupational, or other important areas of functioning, right? And the key word also to take away there is that obviously you do expect a disruption, a loss of function in occupation. Yeah, it does say or. You notice that the definition says in significant distress or significant impairment in these two areas. So either one of those would qualify for the diagnosis. And you might say, well, how do you classify? How do you measure significant distress? And that is a question for the clinician, and it is based, I'm afraid, on experience and training and exposure to the presence of the condition. But actually, I must say, one of the biggest indicators that you have is that dysfunction, is that affecting your work, affecting your family life. Those are the kinds of things that are very strong indicators that something is perhaps gone over the threshold, as it were. So I want you to tell me what you understand when you hear the word anxiety, what you understand yourself. So if you join, you can use the QR code on the screen, or you can just go to slido.com and enter that number that appears on the screen, 25 86 318. And just tell me, tell Richard, what do you think? What crosses your mind when you hear anxiety disorders? What are the characteristics? What do you expect are the most typical characteristics of anxiety disorders? One of the things that might be interesting to hear from you is, again, how would you differentiate between worry, stress, all of these things, and like an anxiety disorder? What are the things that might help you tell them apart from your point of view? If you encounter it yourself, or if you encounter it in somebody that a co-worker, maybe somebody that you're managing, how do you expect to be able to identify those things? That's some of the things that perhaps we can talk about here. So we've got overthinking, we've got panic, got worry, stress. So it's interesting that stress comes up when we talk about anxiety. Stress is thought to be something that is separate from anxiety. It's an interest. It's like is not the anxiety condition, but it's something that we know predisposes to anxiety, to developing an anxiety disorder, or predisposes to developing a depressive disorder, for example. So stress is physiological and psychological stress is something that we see as a risk factor to anxiety. And stress is something that you may very readily experience in a work environment because of like looming deadlines, not enough time, overworking. Those kinds of things might add to your stress, right? And then that might put you at risk to develop an anxiety disorder. May or may not. So you may experience stress, which is quite unpleasant and can be quite difficult by itself, but it is a risk factor to then developing anxiety, if that makes sense. So they are connected, but they're not exactly the same thing.
It's interesting. We've got a good representation of physical symptoms that people are identifying, and then
absolutely. I was going to comment on that. Absolutely, tension in the body, stomach in knots. So those are very physiological symptoms of anxiety. That's absolutely true. Panic is very big in the comments. Overthinking. So these ruminating thoughts where you're worrying and worrying and worrying. Yeah, absolutely. Self-doubt, feeling overwhelmed, having a panic attack. So we've got panic and having a panic attack, and affecting sleep. The type of insomnia that you get in anxiety disorders tends to be what we call initial insomnia. So people tend to take a long time to be able to sleep because they're ruminating and that sort of thing. But also you tend to wake up many times at night as well. So wake up in a bit of a panic as well. So it can affect sleep, that initial insomnia, but also late insomnia as well. Sore muscles, sweating. So those are very common symptoms of perhaps a panic attack, like we're seeing there. I think that's a good mixture. So one of the things that is very characteristic of anxiety disorders that perhaps hasn't come up there is the tendency to, I mean, we've got withdrawn there, but it's the tendency to avoid things, avoid the trigger, the thing that is actually perhaps triggering our anxiety. That is very, very common. It's a central feature of anxiety. It's interesting that it didn't come up here, but it is, we say can't face eating. So taking away your appetite, absolutely, that's all good. But just that avoidance of the thing that may induce the panic attack or induce something is actually a very important characteristic of anxiety. I think we've got somebody that raised their hand. Nisha, I don't know if I can pick it up somehow. Yeah. Nisha, did you want to sort of share something with us? I'm going to unmute you. So if you have a comment, please make it. Hi, Nisha. Okay, maybe not. Sorry, maybe I misunderstood that. But we have Celine. Maybe Celine will say something. Hi, Celine. Do you have a comment for us?
They may be both on mute, Andres. So I'm not sure whether that's something
okay. Can we can control. You can unmute yourselves, I think. I believe. Okay. Maybe Celine.
If not, feel free to put the text.
Yeah, put the question in the chat.
And we'll try and pick that up, Celine.
Apologies for that. The technology didn't work as intended. Okay, let's move on from this. Oops, sorry. And I just want you to know to ask you, what do you think is the 12-month risk? What that means is, in any 12-month period, how likely how frequently will you encounter people with anxiety disorders in, for example, in a working population? Yeah, let's say at work. Okay, slightly different the figure for the general population, but let's say at work. What do people think is the frequency? And yeah, you've seen the choices. We've got 20%, 15%, 10%, and 5%. So what are people thinking about how common it is in any given year to actually have somebody that makes the threshold for the diagnosis of an anxiety condition, be it mild, moderate, or severe? And I think people are thinking around 20%. And that's, that is the higher bound estimate for a 12-month prevalence, yeah? So it is between 10 and 20 in most studies, yeah, depending on where you draw the line. So 10, 20 would be the highest end, but it's between 10 and 20 for a 12-month risk, yeah? And the separate question here, which is what is the lifetime risk? So what is the chance that you'll have any anxiety disorder at any point in your life? Yeah, so it's, and I've got there for you, obviously the numbers are different. So 15, I think is the lowest that I put there, 20, 25, 30, and 35. And what do people think is the right value? So I think most people think it's around the 35. And again, 35, it would be the highest band of the estimate. So it's going to be around, in most studies, it tends to be around the 25% mark, perhaps a little bit higher, yeah? But it is between 15 in the most conservative studies, and actually 30, around 30 in the most catch-all studies, in the studies that actually show the highest prevalence of all of them. So it is actually very, very frequent. I think you were all right in thinking that is that you're very likely to encounter it. You're very likely to encounter it in any given year, and you're very likely to encounter it at some point in your lives. I don't think I need to convince you of that. When do you think they start as a whole? Anxiety disorders. Do they start when people are teenagers, young adults, middle age? When do they tend to start? We've seen the lifetime risk, which is a bit higher than the 12-month risk. And yeah, what are your thoughts here? So most people are thinking for now is teenagers, right? And you're right, absolutely, yes. It is very commonly, that tends to very commonly start in teenagers. But the answer is slightly different depending on the exact anxiety disorder that we're talking about. So I've got a little chart for you to sort of illustrate this point, to try and sort of dig into it a little bit more. And now we're going to be talking about different kinds of anxiety disorder very briefly. So if you look at this bar graph, we've got separation anxiety and simple phobias. Those tend to start, I said teenagers, but those tend to start when people are, 5, 6 years old, right? What is a simple phobia? Something like a spider phobia, a phobia of birds, a phobia of some people have phobia of dogs, barking dogs. Some people have phobias of snakes or things like that. Spiders is the most common because it's something that we tend to encounter. And actually, we seem to be prepared to have a fear of these creepy crawlies. There's a preparedness towards it. So yeah, so those are the most frequent. Separation anxiety is obviously going to nursery, being separated from your parents. That triggers that diagnosis of a separation anxiety. So there we go. So we've got any anxiety. That's the interesting one, right? So you said teenagers, and it was a bit of a trick question because you probably wanted to go younger, but the thing didn't allow you to go younger. Those that were thinking, well, he didn't put the right thing, which is a bit younger than is preteen, you would be right. So if you see any anxiety disorder, the 50% of the onset happens before the age of 11. So it's very, very frequent in young people.
Andres,
yeah.
Quick question on with OCD, for example.
Yes.
What do we know about why something like that disorder would kind of happen in your later teens versus what's that one? Separation. I guess the separation anxiety makes sense. But...
Yeah. So separation anxiety is very much related to attachment as a child. And then, yeah, the simple phobias seem to be because we are I'm going to say genetically prepared to fear certain things, so it could be triggered during that time. A good example that I use is, probably, wall sockets are more dangerous to toddlers than spiders, but almost no toddler has a fear of wall sockets, but many toddlers have a fear of, or many children in the 5, 6 have a fear of spiders, and that tells you that there's some kind of genetic preparedness. Yeah, it does seem to be linked to just our development. So full development for human beings, full neurological development for human beings ends at 25. And you see how different conditions, different anxiety conditions happen at different stages in life. What's interesting is that generalized anxiety disorder, free-floating anxiety is also called, is the one with the later onset. That is actually very interesting and makes it an interesting case study for anxiety disorders. Why is it so late would be the question, because the others happen during development at some point, right? They start triggering. Perhaps the situations that trigger them are different or more relevant to the time. So, for example, social phobia, social anxiety disorder happens when you're a preteen, which is actually when social cues and being part of a group becomes very, very important. You didn't care so much when you were younger, but there's a very clear transition there that happens that seems to be connected to that specific phobia. And you have agoraphobia, which is connected to panic disorder. So they are very close together in the way they act. So panic disorder. So in agoraphobia, very often you have panic attacks. But then you have later on in life you have panic attacks without agoraphobia, which you can see there. That happens a bit later. And then PTSD. Is a matter of when you're exposed to certain things, that's the thing that carries it. But yeah, OCD is an interesting one because OCD is considered an anxiety disorder, but it has some very special characteristics, and it does seem to be, I'm going to say more. There's more a more neurological substrate to OCD than to other anxiety disorders. So it's more heritable, for example, than other anxiety disorders. And it's got slightly different characteristics, some common characteristics, but some different characteristics. So yeah, the thing that I also wanted to convey with this graph is that if you've had an anxiety disorder, perhaps at 5, then you're more likely to develop others later on in life. That's something that we know as well.
One quick question we've got in the chat, Andres, is around the menopause. Can the menopause trigger any of these conditions?
Absolutely. So it's interesting. There is an onset around the menopause. So menopause increases your risk of fundamentally depression, I must say. That's the one that really, really shifts. But anxiety is also. Anxiety goes up by about 60%, the risk of anxiety during the menopause. And it does seem to be linked, as you might expect, to poor sleep and the vasomotor symptoms. So if you have the vasomotor symptoms of the menopause, you're a lot more likely to develop anxiety and depression. But the big one, the one that is 2 to 4 times higher, seems to be depression. But yeah, 60% higher chance of anxiety compared to people compared to earlier in life, for example. So which one out of those do you think is the most frequent? I've got agoraphobia, social phobia. You can put it in the chat just to have a guess. Because social phobia, generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, and agoraphobia. I will say something about agoraphobia because it tends to be misunderstood. Agoraphobia, if I can just boil it down to something that you can easily identify, is a fear of being in an inescapable situation. That's what it looks like. So it could be that you are in a crowd and you feel fear. You could be in a small space, in a small constrained space, and you feel fear. You could be in a tunnel and you feel fear because you cannot escape. If something goes wrong, you could be in a traffic jam. You could be stuck in traffic, and that could trigger agoraphobia. Or you could be in a wide open space where there's no signal, and you feel that fear. Is the fear, if I can boil it down, is the fear of being in an inescapable situation. That's kind of what it boils down to. Just so you have a clear conception, because people will say it's a fear of open spaces. Not exactly. So there we go. The answer is is specific phobias, actually. That's the answer. The biggest ones is specific phobia, which is about 6% of the population. And the one that is most frequent there is spider phobia, as you might expect. And the others hover around the 3-4% of the population. So if you add them all together, you get to those numbers that we were discussing at the beginning. And of course, I've got social phobia, which is quite frequent as well, and separation anxiety. They all linger around the 5% mark. Yeah. So there we go. Now we come to, I just wanted to sort of discuss with you this case. The point of discussing with you this case is to try and help you think through either you encountering a problem with anxiety or a co-worker encountering a problem with anxiety, and about what that may look like, and how to think about it, how to think about when you are encountering it yourself, or when you have somebody that is encountering somebody else and you want to help them out, how to sort of think about this. Yeah. So I've got Joan here, and she's 42. She's a mother of 3. She's an architect, so she's a professional person, and she collapses in the tube on her way to work. She couldn't breathe. She had a pain in her chest. She had palpitations. She had a dry mouth. And on examination, OE means on examination, she had a pulse of 112, which I'm sure you all know is very fast. So that is, I would call that tachycardia. So that's a very, very fast heart rhythm. And I say there's sinus. And what sinus means is that it's rhythmical, it's regular. So it's a regular heartbeat, but it's very, very fast, okay? And then she's got big pupils, but they're both equal, and they're reactive to light. So if you shine a light in her eyes, they both react. They both get smaller when a light is shown in their eye. So she's got this very high frequency. I'm going to try and mimic it for you. High frequency, low amplitude, little tremor. So she's shaking like this. Yeah, that's what that means. Yeah, and it is, is in her hands and arms, and is when she holds a position or when she tries to do something with her hand. You see the shaking. So the question that you might ask yourself is, what's going on with Joan? Yeah, and maybe you can have a guess for yourself about what might be happening here. And I think I'll let you think about it for just a few seconds, just to yourselves. You could put your guesses in the chat as well. We can take a look at that, and see how you're thinking about it.
Yeah,
we've got presentation.
A few things coming in so far. Panic attack. We've got a typical day living with the menopause.
Could be.
Agoraphobia.
Good point. She said, okay, for the menopause point, she's a bit young for the menopause, yeah? So normal onset of the menopause is around 45. So if it was the menopause, that would be worrying in her case. It's a bit too early, yeah.
Yeah, quite a lot of panic attack, claustrophobia, agoraphobia. Yeah, so good guesses. The one thing that perhaps is not been there is that she could have a heart condition. She could. We don't know. That's the point of this, is we don't really know what's going on. We know that she's not very well, and that she's feeling quite terrible, and we see that she's collapsed. But she could have a heart condition. We haven't ruled that out, right? So we don't really know. It could be anxiety. It could be a panic attack. It could be those things that you mentioned. It could be a heart condition, right? We don't know. Now, let's imagine that you with her, you're in the tube. She's a co-worker. What are you going to do is the key question. Are you going to think, oh, she's a panic attack, I'm just going to reassure her? Or are you going to do something else? In normal circumstances, I would say you probably want to ring an ambulance in her case, because she collapsed, she can't breathe, she's got a pain in her chest. It could be anxiety, it could very well be anxiety, but it could be something else. So you're not going to sort of guess, and you're not going to diagnose. You're just going to sort of say, oh, I don't know. I'm going to call an ambulance to sort of make sure that she's okay, right? She may, then the ambulance comes, and she may feel very foolish because it was a panic attack. She should not feel foolish, and you should not feel foolish for ringing that ambulance at all. Why? Because you don't know. You don't know. You need to do the ECG. You need to check her out. You need to make sure. If you rule it out and she's got a panic attack, fantastic. Good news. We did the right thing. She should not feel bad about herself. You should not feel bad about calling an ambulance for her at all. So this happens at work. You help her. The other thing that might be going through your mind is, why is this happening?
You know, why is she, let's imagine that she's got panic attacks. That's the diagnosis in the end. Okay, so panic attack. So she's got this new onset panic. It could go into panic disorder, maybe not, but she's definitely had a panic attack. So good news, she doesn't have a heart condition. Great. But she does have a panic attack, and she could go on to develop more of an anxiety disorder. She could go on to agoraphobia, as somebody said in the chat. So now we need to sort of make sure that we take care of her from that point of view. And it could be for a number of reasons. It could be because something is going on at work. She collapsed on the way to work. So she could be anxious about a situation at work. She could be anxious about what she's going to face. She could be overworked and she doesn't want to, you know, she feels really, really panicky about that. So she's thinking about it, and on her way to work, this happens, right? So that could be a scenario. But it could also be because she's got 3 children at home and then maybe something going on with them. Or it could be a combination of those 2 things or something else, yeah? So it could be work-related, perfectly well, or it could be home-related, or it could be a mixture of both that's contributed together. So she's things going on at work, things going on at home, the combination of those. She's panicking because she's left the kids and she didn't want to leave the kids, but she's also facing a terrible situation at work. And that combination is what led to this situation. So it's important to think widely. So it could be work, it could be home, it could be both. How can we do the best for her is the question that we should ask ourselves. It might be possible to do some adjustments for her at work that may ease the pressure. And then even though she's still got the situation at home, she might fare better. That's the other thing to think about. Yeah. So when you encounter somebody like Joanne, are there any symptoms is the question that you should ask yourself. In Joanne's case, definitely symptoms. You know, we see those symptoms that I described, right? Is there distress? Looked at the definition at the very beginning of the talk. Yes, there is distress. She's quite distressed. Is there dysfunction? Well, she's not able to get to work. So at the moment, there is clear dysfunction. She's impeding her getting to work, definitely. Is there risk? That's a good question to ask yourself. Is there risk? What is the risk that could exist here? And that's where you might think about, well, okay, it could be panic, and that's okay. But it could be early onset menopause, young onset menopause. That could be. But it could be a heart condition as well. So you don't lose track of that. And then that's what should we do? In Joanne's case, we probably want to ring an ambulance to make sure that heart condition that could be life-threatening is not the thing that is happening. Yeah, rule it out, then great. Then we just work on home, things that we can do to help her at home, things that we can help do to help her at work. Yeah. So anxiety disorders in general, do you think they affect more men, more women, or both equally? Okay. So there's a division of opinions there. We've got quite a few participants. Perhaps I'd like to see a few more opinions there. Almost nobody thinks that affects men more. Okay. If you want to say something, the raising hand mechanism, I tried it. It doesn't quite work. Just do you want to make your comment in the chat? I'm sorry. I wish I could sort of do that, but it doesn't seem to be working for me. When I try to unmute people, it just doesn't work. But yeah, so it's either more women or affect both equally. There's more or less there. Almost nobody thinks that affect more men. That, I mean, they do tend to affect women. So you're right. The audience is right. Women are more at risk of anxiety disorders than men are. Men are at risk of other mental health conditions more than women, as you probably know. So, for example, one of the biggest risks that men have way over women is the risk of suicide, for instance. But in this case, yes, for anxiety disorders, for all anxiety disorders, women seem to be a little bit more at risk than men.
There's a couple of comments, Andres, in the chat with respect to the perception that men don't talk about these things as much, so perhaps it's not reported.
No, it's accounting for that. That is a very good comment, and yes, those comments are correct. Men tend to underreport, absolutely. But for this condition in particular, for anxiety, women seem to be more susceptible, even taking into account underreporting. Yeah, so that's an important thing to know, right? Like, for example, there's other conditions in which men are more at risk. It just so happens that anxiety seems to be affect more women than men in general. That doesn't mean that men are immune. That's not true at all. It's actually quite frequent in men as well, as you might expect, right? But it's a bit more frequent in women. That's the even taking into account that. And then I've got the ratio here. So it's not equal across all anxiety disorders. And this is account for this is taking into account help seeking. So it's taking into account that data. So if you look at panic disorder, so it's female to male. So for example, panic disorder is 2.5 times more frequent in women than in men, right? But if you look at something that like social phobia, that one is more frequent in women than in men, but is only around 1.4 times more frequent. So it's a little bit more frequent, that one, social anxiety. And then if you look at any anxiety disorder, is 1.5 more likely in women than men. So for every one man, you've got 1.5 women is the way to sort of think about it. A little bit more than 1.5. Yeah. Just so we know. Oops, sorry. I've got another quick scenario for you to consider. I like to do this one just because it might be a presentation that you may encounter at work. Somebody who's a new worker, somebody that just comes new to your company, somebody that's starting, maybe an apprentice, maybe somebody that you've got under your wing, or it may happen to you yourself when you first start working. And the point of this one, again, so if you look at what I told you before, you're going to think, are there symptoms? Is there distress? Is there risk? You're going to think about those things. Is there other symptoms? Well, yes, he can't stand the sight of knives. He's isolating himself. He refuses to see friends and family. He refuses to go out. There's a few things that are happening there that are symptoms. Okay, so there are symptoms. Is there distress? He seems to be distressed, wouldn't you say? I mean, it's very clearly that he is distressed. Okay, he even has these troubling thoughts of killing his brother. Okay, so there are symptoms, and then you go, is there risk, right? And you might say, well, there could be a number of risks present. He's got these very, very, very worrying thoughts about killing his brother. Definitely, that's kind of very salient. But also, he's isolating himself. He's probably going to lose. Probably won't be able to get into work. Probably going to sort of be off sick. There's other risks other than that just very, very, very visible one. So, what do we do with somebody like him? We could think about diagnosis. Not useful, I would say. Just think about what you would do for somebody like presents with you with his concerns at work, tells you some of these things, very, very shaky, very worried, doesn't know what to do himself, doesn't, for whatever reason made it to work today, but is really, really struggling to get out of his room, really, really struggling to be face to face. And for whatever reason, you establish a good rapport with him and he tells you these things. He has these thoughts, he's got these visions of blood, thoughts about killing his brother. What are we going to do with him? Yeah, that's the thing to think about. Are we going to call an ambulance? Rich, what do you think?
A few different comments. A couple saying to call the doctor, seek medical assistance, refer to a counsellor or your GP. And then we've got comments around no immediate threat to life, so no ambulance required. And naturally, as is the case, people have tended to lead towards that diagnosis, which can happen in these sort of settings, right?
Yeah.
But it seems the majority are, speak to them, refer them to a GP or a counsellor.
Yeah, it's to try and make sure that he does get that right help, right? So he's trying to sort of persuade him that what he needs to do is do these things, and try to, obviously so the way he presents is extremely anxious. That's the outward look. He really doesn't want to go anywhere near his family because he's worried about hurting them. That's the prevailing fear is doing something to hurt his family or hurt somebody else. That's what he really, really is worried about. Yeah. People said no immediate risk to life. There's certainly no risk to his life. He doesn't seem to be having suicidal thoughts or anything like that. I don't know if was any comments about whether they feel people like his brother is at risk in this presentation.
Yeah, just literally as you said that, there's a comment around possibly the police, as there could be a threat to his brother.
Yeah, and I wouldn't blame you for thinking that way. And obviously, with this presentation, we don't know. We really don't know, because all we know is that we're talking to William, and he's very worried. I mean, I would advocate to try and see if he's willing to get him to see a professional first, in the case that I'm thinking, in the particular scenario that I'm thinking, somebody like him would be extremely willing to go and see somebody, so they wouldn't resist that. So again, take them to a place of safety, maybe not involve the police if he's willing to go. If you're very worried and he's out of control and he's not willing to listen to advice, then you might have to call the police because you don't know what's going on, right? Does that make sense? So if somebody's willing to go to a place of safety, and maybe you accompany them, maybe you arrange for them to go on a taxi or something like that, fine. If they're not willing to go to a place of safety, that's when you might think about involving the police. Yeah.
We've got a comment from Dhiren on around ascertaining if he has any thoughts of actually acting on.
Yeah, so that's a very, very good question. No, so he really doesn't want to do anything like this. He just feels that he might become out of control and he might lose, his ability to control his own behavior. And what he says is, I might go crazy. That's what he's saying. Yeah. By the way, William is based on a real case that I looked after. So I'm not making it up. So it is a real case that came to see me as a clinician. So the diagnosis, I don't know if anybody has a diagnosis, but just out of interest. And again, don't feel tempted to go down the diagnosis because we don't really know. But if anybody had a guess, I would be interested.
I think we had PTSD, early onset of schizophrenia, OCD.
OCD was the right diagnosis for William. Yeah. So it's a very, it's not an unfrequent, I mean, OCD is rare, but it's not an unfrequent presentation of OCD. There is the checking, the washing the hands, the things that we probably know and heard of, or things like, doing things many times, checking that the lock is locked, that sort of thing. But there's a presentation that is not terribly uncommon, which is this one, which is this worry about hurting somebody else. Yeah. So this is a presentation of OCD, not an uncommon one. But the thing that to say is that his brother's not at risk at all. If this is OCD, the brother's not at risk at all. So types of anxiety, which one is the most heritable? Which one do people think? Maybe based on what I was saying before. Interestingly, yeah. So interestingly, the most inheritable of all is arachnophobia, but close second will be OCD. Yeah. So arachnophobia, as I said, it's got this very deeply entrenched genetic component for some reason. I mean, it comes from ancestral evolutionary history, probably. That's my theory anyway. But the second most frequent would be OCD. So those people that said OCD, don't feel that you're wrong. You're actually right. Is that arachnophobia just edges it out, just by a little bit. The most common comorbidities, what comorbidity means is, if you have anxiety, what is the other thing that you may present with? If you have a second diagnosis, which one would it be? And I've got schizophrenia, somebody mentioned schizophrenia, dementia, bulimia, autism, substance misuse, and depression there for choices. And I don't know if people want to have a guess at that. Quick guess.
Quite a lot for depression. There's also substance misuse.
Yeah. Substance misuse is a very interesting comment. Yes.
Couple autism.
Yeah. So obviously, the anxiety may present in all of these. Yeah, that's why they're all there, right? In autism, it tends to actually present very frequently with autism. Is one of the most salient features of autism, having anxiety. Substance misuse is very frequently associated, and the reason tends to be, if you take a good careful history of somebody with anxiety, is that they may use the substance to treat the anxiety. So they use it as to medicate their problem before actually being able to seek help. And by the time they come see somebody like me, then we have to contend with two things. We have to contend with the substance misuse and also the anxiety disorder, which can complicate the treatment, as you might expect. But that tends to be the scenario, trying to treat those anxiety symptoms with alcohol or with other substances. Yeah. As most people guessed, you're all right. The most frequent comorbidity is, in fact, depression. That's correct. Okay, so now we're just going to consider what are we going to do in terms of treatment? So we know what we're going to do when we have somebody who presents. We're going to sort of think about distress, dysfunction, risk, and based on that, make a decision. Are we going to, are we just going to reassure them? Are we going to encourage them very strongly to seek help soon? Like go to the GP, go to a counselor, access your at work. There might be an EAP. There might be the Thrive app. If you have the Thrive app and you have access to our therapists, definitely encourage them to do that. We'll talk to them and we'll start therapy with them or point them in the right direction. Definitely. Or you're going to actually need to do something more drastic, call an ambulance. As I said, in some scenarios, even the police might be necessary. So that's what you're going to sort of think about. And you all know this. You don't need to know the diagnosis. You would do the same thing if you encountered me with chest pain. If I've got chest pain, I may be panicking, but I may have a heart attack. I need an ambulance, really. If I am presenting like William, I'm shaky like a leaf, and I'm really not coping, and I'm not functioning at all, so I cannot really be at work, but I can probably be encouraged and to go to even A&E now, and somebody can take me. Yeah, that'll be fine. So we've got a few treatments here that I just put up because they tend to be, if you have anxiety, you may have come across these. If you've got somebody in your life that has anxiety, you may have come across these. So the first one is neuroleptics. Neuroleptics were originally developed to treat schizophrenia specifically, but they've seen some application in some severe cases of anxiety. Some of them, not all of them. Do they work? Not really, I must say. So the evidence is against them. So they used to be used more frequently for severe cases. Now some of my colleagues may prescribe them. The evidence is not really behind them. On balance. Yeah, if you have a comorbid condition that requires them, fair enough. But for anxiety alone, doesn't seem to be helpful. Anti-epileptics, some specific anti-epileptics have been used for anxiety, and they can work. So the two gabapentin and pregabalin, they seem to sort of maybe do something for anxiety. Again, they were used in severe cases as like a second-line treatment. They can be useful in some cases, a minority of cases, I would say. It's only under special supervision. And then we've got obviously cognitive behavioral therapy, or therapy in general, but cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy is the treatment of choice for anything that is mild, moderate, or even severe. Even at the low end of severe, still cognitive behavioral therapy is the #1 treatment and the thing that works the best. It does require the person to put in some hard work, and because I said one of the principal characteristics of anxiety disorders is avoidance. So avoiding certain things. For example, in agoraphobia, you're going to avoid crowded spaces, or you're going to avoid going on a train, or you're going to avoid those things. Panic attacks, you're going to avoid the thing that causes a panic. If you have a simple phobia, you're going to avoid the spiders, right? So CBT, a lot of the behavioral component of CBT is about overcoming that avoidance. Very, very important. And that is unpleasant and requires a lot of work. So that's why it's very effective, but it can be difficult. And getting people to finish the treatment, which does give you good results, can be a problem. And motivating yourself or motivating a colleague or a loved one to finish the thing can be a bit difficult. Computerized CBT can work very well. We obviously have that in the Thrive app, as I think Rich will mention later. The way to use it best is if you have like we do in our own service. If you have like a guided self-help, if you have somebody that's guiding you through it, that tends to be more successful. You can do it yourself, definitely. It's just getting the motivation to finish it. And if you do finish it, we do get comparable results as CBT with a therapist. The problem is getting motivated, keeping going. Actually, some people can experience setbacks, and with a therapist, you can overcome those setbacks. And if you're doing it on your own, it might be harder. So benzodiazepines are sedatives. They can be frequently used, but they tend not to be very useful because they can increase. I mean, they all induce tolerance. What that means is that you may need more benzodiazepines to treat the same thing. So you need more and more of the dose, and they are addictive, which is a big drawback. Now, Antidepressants is the treatment that is the second best treatment if you no, maybe the third best treatment if you're not going to do CBT. Why? Because selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors seem to have a good effect. They don't cause dependence, and they are well tolerated. They don't induce any risks. They're fairly safe. Compared to any other medication that you might take, they're kind of like the safest. Again, they're second line. Your best intervention is to go first with the psychological treatments. Actually, exercise is also a good intervention for anxiety. It's better for depression, but it's good for anxiety in itself as a form of treatment, interestingly. So if you manage to motivate yourself to do exercise, that has an impact and can actually resolve some presentations of anxiety, interestingly. Applied relaxation is an advanced mode is an advanced protocol for learning how to do very deep relaxation. It's very behavioral, very deep relaxation very quickly. It suits some people very well because sometimes the cognitive behavioral therapy, the cognitive component, or even the behavioral component, that exposure that I was talking about, can be quite hard. And this one is a lot easier to do for some people. And it involves just reducing, being very able to reduce physiological stress, the physiological reaction. So those things that you put there in the thing at the beginning, the knotted stomach, the sweating, all of those negative sensations, is about getting control over them over time, just learning how to control that very, very well. And by disconnecting that bit, by deactivating that physical reaction, you're able then to cope a lot better with the symptoms of anxiety. And actually, in some cases, that's the whole treatment that you need. And virtual reality, the reason I put it there is because it has shown to be promising in some forms of exposure. For example, if you have a fear of flying and I want to do the exposure, I can make you imagine flying if I want to treat that. But I can get a lot more success by simulating you going on a plane, for instance. Similar with spider phobia, similar with agoraphobia. Those things that require exposure seem to be a benefit from that approach, from that virtual reality approach. I think I'm going to leave this one to you, Rich, if you want.
Yeah, sounds good. We've just recognizing there's a few questions which we'll try and tie off at the end.
Okay.
We might not be able to get to everyone, but we'll try and answer what we can at the end. So yeah, I just want to spend a bit of time sort of bringing up this subject of coping mechanisms. So we just heard, Andres, about various treatments with the evidence base that sits behind them. And then we have this sort of notion of healthy and unhealthy coping mechanisms. And I guess for the audience, it would be good to understand, just maybe pop a message in the chat, which of these, if any, sort of resonate with you as mechanisms for alleviating, gaining some relief from some of the symptoms if you are affected by anxiety or an anxiety disorder. Got comments around yoga, mindfulness and exercise. Exercise is certainly one for me, and I think there's something in that. They call it completing the stress cycle, where your body's triggered, and it's saying do something and move, and actually by doing that and getting moving and being active, you can help sort of complete that cycle. Sleep, it's come up there. Journaling, around giving up on alcohol.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So alcohol can actually feel like it's treating the problem, but it's actually making it worse. So that's a very good point. It feels like you get immediate relief, but actually in the long run, it makes it worse. So that's a very good point. Yeah, giving up alcohol.
What is it you think about? So some of these, the unhealthy. So I don't mind sharing. The other day I had a pretty stressful day, and I was thinking, right, I'll go for a pint, but I ended up actually going for a run. So I gave myself a bit of a pat on the back, but the instinct was, this is probably the easier way of taking the edge off the day, if you like, which is not a healthy way, right, of sort of doing, but we're drawn to it because it may be easier. I mean,
not to demonize it completely. One of the things about going for a pint, again, the alcohol, I wouldn't see the alcohol as the solution to the stress. But what is a solution to the stress or to the anxiety is sharing time with a few friends.
Yes.
That social contact is actually something that does help quite a lot. And we know that even as a treatment, or as a component of a treatment, increasing social contact when you're prone to avoid it can actually resolve anxiety or help to resolve anxiety.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to just put a bit of attention on was around this avoidance. So you may have a healthy coping mechanism that might be going to the gym, for example, but you might over-index on that because you're avoiding what the actual trigger is. So it's very healthy for you going to the gym, but you could take it to the excess, right, and be avoiding the situation.
That's right. So, I mean, somebody mentioned sleep, and the sleep is always, in the average case, sleep is very good. It's very restorative. If you have good sleep, good quality sleep, you're less likely to have anxiety, definitely, yeah? But if it's used as an avoidance strategy, it could be counterproductive. So it's about that balance,
Great. And then we've got comments around just talking, having a conversation with someone, talking things through.
Definitely.
Social connection.
That social connection seems to be very important. And again, I think it's very important the point that you made about completing the cycle. So why running? Why exercise? Because stress, like physiological stress that comes with anxiety, that heart rate goes up, sweating, pupils dilate, all of those, knots in the stomach, all of those things are preparing us to do one or two things: run, flee or fight, or freeze sometimes. But one of those. If we actually run, we actually complete the cycle, and it seems to actually be very helpful. Yeah.
Great. If we nip on to the next slide, please, Andres.
Oh yeah, sorry.
I don't know if I can control that, but
nope, I've gone too
far. That one's fine. So for those of you that do have access to our service, I've seen there's a couple of questions around what's the access code. So we have access to a range of techniques that I'm going to talk to you about on the next slide, but you can scan that QR code if you are a customer and an employee that's got access. Your employer should know the code. If you don't, you can get in touch with us at help@thrive.uk.com and we'll help you out. I'm going to just talk to you about some of the techniques that may help alleviate some of the symptoms which we have in the app. So if we go on to the next one, please, Andres. So from left to right, so this is well, it's relatively new now, but the new version of our app. And the first thing to say is, like, I guess any health condition, is getting on top of the issue early is the right thing to do. And we have a daily checkup feature within the app that is everything that you do within the app is anonymous, it's confidential, and you can access the daily checkup. It gives you the ability to check in on how you're feeling. And then dependent on how you go through that process, it may trigger a series of questions that is looking to spot for signs of anxiety or depression. And then we refer you through the app to the relevant sort of help. So whether that's speaking to one of our therapists or whether it's the techniques within the app that could help manage a condition if it's a more mild presentation. A couple of the ones I wanted to highlight, which I find personally pretty effective, is the deep muscle relaxation. Now, we are redeveloping our applied relaxation module, which Andres mentioned as a treatment, but in its essence, it's tensing and relaxing muscle groups, moving through the body, switching off that tension in the body, and in turn calming the mind. Can really be very helpful, I find, just before bed if your mind's kind of racing, to calm those thoughts. And then we've had quite a few comments around meditation and mindfulness exercises. They're all available within the app. So if you are an existing customer, an employee that's got access to our service, or if you'd like to find out more, then just get in touch with us. But loads of techniques in there that can help you sort of alleviate some of the symptoms which you might be experiencing when experiencing an anxiety disorder, or just generally feeling a bit uptight and stressed as well. So let's try and address a couple of the questions that have come in the last 3 minutes that we've got together.
I wanted to comment on something that Elaine said, just to clarify. So yes, she's saying that avoidance of triggers can be helpful. Yeah, I mean, she makes a good point that, sometimes removing a specific trigger, it really does depend on what the trigger is and to what extent. So there is an ongoing debate in the literature even about whether to expose or not to expose and how, right? And this even goes all the way to the treatment for PTSD and things like that. So that is a good point. In some cases where, encountering, so when your trigger is not expanding, so the problem with avoidance is that sometimes the trigger expands. So, if at the beginning I was very worried about very crowded spaces, and then I start avoiding very, very crowded spaces, then my trigger goes on to less crowded spaces, and then my trigger goes to any space, and then my triggers go to, if I encounter somebody on the street, that I'm already struggling, because I fear that there might be a crowd, and then I develop a fear of fear. If you see that escalation, then avoidance is unhelpful. But if you don't see that escalation, if the triggers are very discrete and they're not increasing in anxiety, there could be an argument for not exposing, and that's fair enough. Yeah.
There's one comment around you'll receive a recording of the session, so if you've attended, so you'll get a recording of the session. I also wanted to pick out probably one or two last ones. So how does someone differentiate a fear that is rational versus what could be an anxiety disorder?
Yeah, so that is a very good question, is whether it causes dysfunction, right? Is whether it's impeding you achieving what you want to achieve. And then, so once you've identified it, then you can decide what to do about it. And the answer could be nothing. Yeah. So let's imagine that I do have a phobia. I do have an irrational fear of spiders. So if I see just a spider web, then I go into a panic and I'm very distressed. But I can still go to work and I can still do what I need to do, and I'm not worried about maybe seeing a spider web on my car and then reacting to that very badly and getting into an accident. So maybe my fear is irrational, so it's not it's not in keeping with the actual trigger, but I may not want to do anything about it because it doesn't really impair anything. So is it irrational? It's irrational when you don't think it's in keeping. And for anxiety disorders, when you ask somebody that has a phobia, for example, they tend to be very clear whether it's rational or not themselves. So when you talk to them and when they talk to themselves, they know that perhaps is not right. You do have good insight into the fact that it is causing you a problem, that the fact that it is impeding your function, the fact that it is causing you undue distress. So it's actually not hard to notice when it slips that bound. If you're still not clear, then consult with bouncing it off somebody else, particularly a professional. Talking to one of our therapists would help clarify it. Yeah.
Right. We're at 1 o'clock, and I can see that several people have had to go to their next meeting. So,
yeah, of course.
I guess just a big thank you from everyone.
Thank you all.
For your attendance, for your engagement and discussion. Sorry if we didn't get to all the questions that you had, but yeah, thank you very much for attending, and I hope the session was insightful.
Yeah, and your participation, very, very, very welcome. So thank you all.
Yeah, much appreciated.
Great, and I'm sorry that I couldn't unmute people, but yeah, thank you very much.
All right, thank you.